Bloodborne, the grim and gloomy spiritual successor to Dark Souls, was one of the PS4's first killer apps, and today, at the very end of the generation, it's still in like my top 5 PS4 games of all time. I absolutely love it. Despite its huge success though and the fanbase it has cultivated, the idea of a Bloodborne 2 has never got past the rumour stage since the first game launched in March 2015. Nothing concrete has ever emerged, but why? Sony, why haven't you made Bloodborne 2? I mean, Dark Souls got plenty of sequels, and even Demon Souls is coming back on PlayStation 5, but when it comes to Bloodborne, we've heard pretty much nothing. Admittedly, money isn't the only factor that goes into studios greenlighting a sequel, and the reason we haven't got that sequel might actually have more to do with how the original Bloodborne ended. I mean, how would a Bloodborne 2 even work? How would the events of the original shape and influence a proper follow-up? Well, let's dive into those queries right now and take a look at some possible answers. As players of the original game will know, the origins of the Scourge of the Beast actually lies in the blood of the Great Ones. These are ancient Lovecraftian beings that were worshipped by the Thumerians, a race that dwelt in the elaborate subterranean areas upon which Yharnam was built. Blood ministration became the practice of Yharnam, a process that could supposedly cure all ills, but in reality, well, it tended to just make people cloy, furry, or have an assortment of other hideous side effects. In the game, the player quickly finds that their objective in this horrifying world is to find the Pale Blood and put a stop to this scourge and escape this reality. Fighting their way through Yharnam, the player eventually goes up against Rom, the vacuous spider, whose role is to actually veil the reality of what's going on to the people of this city. This little geezer essentially kept all of these big beasties out of sight. With Rom vanquished, the hunter could then dispatch Mikolash, host of the nightmare, whose Mensis scholars had attempted to commune with a Great One before moving on to slay Murgo itself. That's the being that was the very source of the sickness. After this, there are 3 potential endings to the game, which is actually where the dilemma of making a Bloodborne 2 arises in the first place. That's because if the player accepts Gehrman, the first hunter's offer to escape the dream, they will be met by his burial blade and will be taken from this world and plucked back into reality, presumably without any of the memories of ever being in the dream or fighting back the beasts. They're just decapitated and then they wake up in Yharnam proper. Should they refuse though, a battle with Gehrman ensues, after which the Moon Presence, another Great One which created the Hunter's Dream, captures and enthralls the player, who then takes Gehrman's place as the hunts continue. Here's the rub though. If the player is perceptive enough to find the 3 different thirds of umbilical cord spread throughout the game, they can actually access a secret third ending. This allows you to learn more about the origins of the Great One, and this time around, if you refuse Gehrman, you can actually fight back against the Moon Presence. Defeat this final boss and players then will ascend and become a Great One themselves, being left in the care of the doll. Right, phew, thank you for sticking with me through that, but now that I've explained all the different endings, you can see just how complicated it would be to pick up straight after those events in a Bloodborne 2. I mean, was the hunter's purpose fulfilled and the nightmare ended in the first place? Either it definitely wasn't, or it kinda was, depending on which ending you got. It's not really totally clear. Likewise, which was more significant in that sense, the demise of Murgo or the demise of the Moon Presence? As always, when it comes to FromSoftware's world building, so much is left up to the interpretation of the player, and in the context of Bloodborne 1, that's for the best. What we bring to that ending makes it so special, but it makes it tricky to start a sequel. Still, one possible way to make a sequel is to just pick up where the last game left off. As I've hinted at so far though, this will probably be the most difficult thing to do, just considering the state of Bloodborne's world at the end of the first title. With the Moon Presence, Murgo and Mikolash, and possibly Healing Church founder Lawrence and legendary hunter Ludwig, if the player defeated them in the DLC, all gone from this plane, and the hunter a tiny squid leech of a baby Great One, who's in charge here? What would a new hunter's objective even be? It's a huge logistical challenge to figure all of these different intricacies out. Perhaps then, just like Dark Souls before it might not be the best idea to just pick up where the last game left off, and instead maybe the developers should jump forward in time, jump into the future, and let us see what comes next. A new town constructed in Yharnam's shadow, whose residents discover the power of the blood, which was never snuffed out in the original game, could offer a starting point for a sequel. They might find this blood and make their own Scourge of Beasts, with the cycle continuing further on down the line. After all, the Great Ones are tricky, deceptive beings, and there's no saying that they couldn't get their hands on another surrogate further on down the line. I mean, they're like 20-foot tall tentacle abominations. They could do whatever the heck they like. They are beyond comprehension. There's no reason why this cycle couldn't continue in time. The difficulty with a future setting, though, is that it might compromise everything that Bloodborne was loved for artistically in the first place. You know, the misty Victorian vibe, the mechanical trick weapons, and even the Dark Souls-esque atmosphere that the whole thing had. This is all part of the original's identity and is what struck a chord with players in the first place, so the developers and the publisher probably don't want to deviate too much from that basis. They could jump into the future yet retain the similar aesthetic on the idea that it's just a cycle repeating itself, but the problem with that is that that idea has kind of been done in Dark Souls. We don't really want the familiar, because the whole appeal of Bloodborne in a way was that the Bram Stoker-esque horror was totally upended halfway through, and then it became this cosmic Lovecraftian nightmare. The key with follow-ups is to retain everything that fans loved about the original, but not just have a retread or a game that feels like an expansion pack, because pretty much we've already got that with the new Hunters DLC. We don't just want Bloodborne 1.5. Of course, this is an extremely difficult balancing act, and speaking of the DLC, Bloodborne 2 might actually be able to take a few cues from the old Hunters to craft an interesting and proper sequel that retains a lot of the elements that the original so succeeded in bringing to life. That's because this mini-campaign served as a kind of prequel of sorts. It presented the Hunters of yore, trapped in a nightmarish world as punishment for their bloodthirsty ways. It's where some of the game's most fiendish bosses are fought, and some of the most intriguing weapons and hunter tools are discovered. The weapons found here, like the Beast Cutter, are more inelegant, more brutal, and just more primitive than what we had in the main game. Likewise, NPC hunters are seen brawling with beasts in the street, giving us a Bloodborne at its most vicious, at its most brutal, and at its most bloodthirsty. It goes much deeper than just being a bit grittier though. Later in the DLC, in the research hall, we get to see the grotesque depths that the Healing Church took their experiments to, and the horrific secrets they tried to hide. Finally, in the fishing hamlet, we learn why the Hunter's nightmare exists in the first place and why these people are being punished. All in all, the old Hunters maintains the intrigue established in the main game, in fact maybe even emboldening it, while giving us those great trick weapons, that great combat, just blowing things up to a more brutal scale, and diving even further into the lore, which in many cases actually raised more questions than it actually answered. Giving players the chance to witness these horrors firsthand, rather than just hear of something awful and Lovecraftian that happened long before the Hunter's arrival, gave this section of the game an eerie edge over the rest in some respects. This was a feeling that exploring these familiar yet distinctly different environments only added to as well. If FromSoftware were able to tap into this idea for a sequel, going more primitive, going further back in time, and diving even deeper into this ancient lore, that could be great, that could be really cool. A prequel that dove straight into the very first beast hunts could be a way of keeping the series fresh while expanding on what made the first game so good. The Hunter's Nightmare threw players into a twisted version of the Cathedral Ward area, so why not take that idea even further in the sequel? We could get a chance to play through the burning of old Yharnam, the Healing Church forsaking the people and barricading themselves away, and other events that are only alluded to through dialogue and lore. As for the timescales of past, present, and future, the very nature of the dream world means there could be a hub where everything connects, where you can jump through these different periods and still have it make sense. The labyrinths below Yharnam could also make for even more fertile ground to explore as well. There is so much about those areas that we just don't know about, and most of them were just left up to procedurally generated AI systems in the original, but there are secrets there, and there is lore there to tap into even more if it was an even bigger focus of the game. There are so many secrets hidden down there, and I just want to dig deeper into them. Of course, Bloodborne 2 shouldn't undergo a paradigm shift to be a slower game or anything like that just because it's going back in time. In fact, the quick, agile hunters and their offhand gun to parry enemies with is what made this so distinct from Dark Souls from a mechanical perspective. The two games share DNA, but they play completely different. If you lose its unique mechanics, then you would lose a part of its identity, like I said earlier. Consequently, then, the most important thing is to continue the first game's legacy without compromising it as a piece of art. Reliving the glory days of the first Beast Hunts would be an amazing way to dive into the history of this franchise, but it doesn't have to make up the whole game. There are so many more creative ways that you could explore this world. That can just be one part of it, something you finally see rather than just hear about. Balancing the old and new, the gothic with the eldritch, the idea of old Yharnam and a future city built on top of it, these are potentially contrasting things, but you could bring them all together through the idea of this nightmare, this dream. You could link them both and essentially have your cake and also eat it too. I mean, that's easier said than done. So what would be the neatest way to link all of these disparate elements together? Well, we know one thing for sure. Hunters are in some way tied to the dream, and in some cases can actually escape from it. So what if in the sequel, the player could travel between the dream and reality just at will? Say Gehrman frees the player with a snicker snacker of his blade, and then they're back in reality. Can they go back to the dream at all? Would they want to go back to the dream if they're nagged by subconscious memories of things just prying at them when they sleep, things they think they see in the dark? They know they've been there and they kind of have a drive to seek it out, even though it will probably just get them killed. I mean, could they feel a duty to go back, to try and finish the dream in a good way, not just leave this cycle continuing? Influencing and changing the past is a common plot driver as well, and it could come into play in a plot like this. After all, only one tainted by the blood who knows of its roots and its nastiness and its horrible law and underbelly, they're the only people who are actually capable of combating it. A retrospective attempt to stop the insidious work of the Healing Church in the Church of Mensis, for instance, would be a fascinating plot thread to follow, though it does maybe run the risk of making elements of plot from the first game a little redundant. If there's one thing Bloodborne's endings emphasize though, it's the idea of cycles, like I've said so many times throughout this video. The idea that cycles begin and can be renewed and begin anew again. Whether the player wakes up in reality or takes, presumably, the place of the moon presence, nothing has really been done to end this cycle. It just presumably continues in a slightly different way. This could be another crucial thing to Bloodborne 2. What happens if you properly try to break the cycle and you achieve it? What even comes next if the Great Ones do disappear? Just how embedded is their influence in the entire world? Obviously, if this was the focus, the stakes of Bloodborne 2 would be incredibly high. There's no kind of safety net now if the cycle is broken. It's anyone's mad grab for power, and anyone can kind of shape the world now that it's free in their image. And presumably you want a good guy at the helm to do that. I mean, I'm saying this and I'm running myself in circles, but to be honest, I don't envy anyone who has to try to make a follow-up to the original Bloodborne. Making something that satisfies fans doesn't stray too far from what made the original great, but still has that subversive, surprising element. It's difficult, and developers, honestly, no matter how talented they are, rarely hit that nail on the head. They rarely live up to those lofty expectations. We could just have more Bloodborne, I guess, but for me, if you want to make a sequel to this game, you have to have those subversive elements. You have to do something original with this Lovecraftian premise to kind of justify its existence. Like I said, we've already technically kind of had Bloodborne 1.5. It was great. Don't need another one. Of course, this is the beauty about sequels in general. I have my ideas, you have your ideas, the developers have their own ideas, and I just want to see something materialize because this is such a rich franchise with such compelling lore, and there are so many possibilities. So, those have been my ramblings about Bloodborne 2. I've been running myself in circles, and I kind of feel like I've turned into a great one at the moment. I've got like tentacles coming out of the back, it's going through the couch. I don't know, I'm gonna stop wasting your time now, but if you did like this video, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, genuinely thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.